ask myself every night when I lie in bed, unable to sleep. The thing is, I know exactly why. Everything is just as it should be. He works, I stay at home, and we pretend everything is fine. But I feel it. Those normal days growing emptier, like we're drifting further apart with each passing month. Today wasn't like the usual days. I was sitting in my office reading some article about how women like me begin to lose themselves in marriage, and then the phone rang. It was him. I still haven't gotten used to the fact that he's starting to forget about our evenings together. But when I heard his voice, there was none of the warmth I had grown used to. A simple question, "How are you?" And I knew everything else would be meaningless. When he came home, I could tell something was off. He wasn't the man I had married, the one who would sit across from me and smile, tell me about his day, the man whose presence used to make me feel safe. Now he seemed distant. I couldn't figure out why it bothered me so much. I told myself I had no reason to complain. We've been married for several years now. But that wasn't the real issue. The real issue was how he said it, like it was the most normal thing in the world. As if nothing had changed between us. But everything had. And I could feel it. "He'll stay with us until he finds a place," my husband said, not even bothering to look me in the eye. I should have been fine with it. It was practical. It made sense. But there was something unsettling about his tone. A quiet, almost imperceptible fear. It wasn't the son's visit that made me anxious. It was the fact that it would change everything between us, and I knew I wasn't ready for that. I was used to being alone in this house when he was gone. But with Artem here, everything would be different. Suddenly, I wasn't sure if I was ready for this change. My husband had always been distant, but now it felt like he was pushing me further away, as if the space between us was becoming unbridgeable. And there it was, the moment I felt it, the first spark of something unsettling. It wasn't just that Artem was coming. It was how everything in my life, everything I had taken for granted, seemed to be shifting under my feet. The days blended together in a haze of routine after Artem moved in. It was a small adjustment at first. A few extra plates at the dinner table, his shoes left at the door, silent tension in the air, an unspoken connection that neither of us acknowledged directly. His compliments, at first seemingly innocent, started to linger in the air longer than they should have. He would tell me I looked beautiful even when I was just putting away groceries or folding laundry. His voice was too smooth, too sincere, and the way his eyes would linger on me made my skin prickle. It wasn't like the way my husband used to look at me, full of history and affection. No, Artem's gaze felt different, like it was assessing, lingering, questioning. I started to feel uncomfortable in my own skin, aware of how often he would be close by, how often he would find some excuse to pass by me in the hall or sit just a little too close on the couch. His presence was undeniable, like a shadow that followed me no matter where I went in the house. It wasn't that he was doing anything overtly wrong, but there was a weight in the air, an unspoken charge that I couldn't escape. My husband, as usual, was too absorbed in his work to notice. The long hours away, the business trips that seemed to stretch endlessly, gave Artem and I a chance to interact in ways that were becoming harder to ignore. I started to notice how he would enter a room when I was alone, how his presence would shift the space between us, making me hyper-aware of my every movement. Every time he smiled at me, it seemed like there was something more there, something just beneath the surface that he didn't say out loud. I tried to dismiss it, to convince myself that it was all in my head. After all, he was just staying with us for a little while until he figured things out. He was young, and I was still trying to adjust to this new reality of having him in our home. But the more time we spent together, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that he was intentionally pushing boundaries, testing limits that had always been clear to me before. One evening, when my husband was away on another one of his business trips, the house felt strangely quieter, the air thicker. Artem and I were alone, sitting in the living room, both immersed in our respective activities. I was skimming through a magazine, barely paying attention, trying to avoid the nagging feeling that something was about to happen, something that would make everything feel different. As I shifted in my seat, adjusting my position, I felt his hand brush against mine. An accidental touch, but one that didn't feel accidental at all. It was brief, but my skin tingled at the contact, and when I looked up, our eyes met. His gaze wasn't casual, wasn't fleeting like it usually was when we exchanged glances. No, this time his eyes were locked onto mine, and I couldn't look away. I felt a pulse of warmth rush through me, my heart beating faster than it should have. His lips parted slightly as though he was about to say something, but no words came. The silence between us stretched on, thick with tension, heavy with unspoken questions. I quickly withdrew my hand, not wanting to acknowledge the way my body was reacting to that simple touch, but I couldn't deny it. The tension that had been simmering between us for days had reached its peak, and it felt like the line between what was appropriate and what wasn't had been blurred. As I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, trying to regain some composure, I couldn't stop the rush of thoughts flooding my mind. Was I imagining things? Was I reading too much into this? I wanted to believe that it was just a mistake, just an accident. But deep down I knew it wasn't. His eyes told me everything. They held a certain intensity, a certain challenge. It wasn't just a touch. It was a spark, a flicker of something more. Something I wasn't prepared for. Something that felt dangerously close to crossing a line I couldn't uncross. I never expected things to escalate the way they did. It started off so subtly, like a slow burn, a quiet shift in the air that I couldn't quite explain. One evening, when my husband was away and the house was eerily quiet, I found myself in the living room, sorting through old magazines. I thought the silence would be comforting, but there was something about the stillness that felt unsettling. I wasn't sure if it was because of the emptiness or the fact that Artem was home, yet again just a few steps away. He wasn't doing anything overt, just sitting across from me, his attention focused on his phone. But the way he glanced up at me, the intensity in his eyes felt different. There was a pull in his gaze that drew me in, and for a moment I couldn't tear my eyes away from his. It was as if we were standing at the edge of something we both knew we shouldn't cross. Without saying a word, Artem stood up and walked over to where I was sitting. His movements were deliberate, his steps slow, and before I knew it he was right in front of me, his presence so close I could feel the heat radiating off his body. He didn't say anything at first. Instead he simply stood there, and for a long moment we just looked at each other. I could see the flicker of something in his eyes, something unreadable but unmistakable. The air between us felt thick, charged with an energy I wasn't sure I could handle. Without a word, he reached down and placed a hand on my shoulder, gently guiding me to stand. The touch was light, almost like a question. I didn't pull away. It was like a magnet pulling me in despite the war inside me telling me to stop. And then, before I could process it, his face was close to mine. I could feel the warmth of his breath, hear the steady beat of his heart. He didn't ask for permission, he simply leaned in and kissed me. The shock of it was almost paralyzing, but I didn't pull back. For a moment I simply stood there, letting the sensation wash over me, unsure of what to do. His lips were soft but insistent, the kiss deepening, and for that moment, everything felt blurred. I didn't know whether it was the right thing or the wrong thing. All I knew was that it felt so real. So immediate. The world seemed to stop as I let myself succumb to the moment, but as soon as it ended I stepped back, heart racing, mind spinning. I couldn't believe what had just happened. But deep down I knew. I knew this was more than just a moment of weakness. I couldn't ignore what it meant. This wasn't just a kiss. It was a crossing of lines, a line that, once crossed, would be impossible to erase. And as I stood there, my mind racing, I realized with a heavy heart that this wasn't just a one-time thing. Something had shifted inside me, and now I couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. It was too late. I was already hiding it. I felt the guilt gnawing at me, the weight of it heavy and suffocating, a constant reminder of the lines I had crossed without fully understanding where they would lead. My mind was torn between my duty as a wife and the raw, undeniable attraction that seemed to bind me to him, to my stepson. Every time I saw him, every time our eyes met, I felt something stir within me. Something I didn't want, something I tried to bury under layers of self-control. But no matter how hard I tried to push it away, it always found its way back to the surface, lurking in the corners of my mind, waiting for the right moment to resurface. I couldn't stop thinking about that kiss, how it had felt, how it had shaken me to my core. It wasn't just the kiss. It was the way my body responded to him, the way my heart raced when he was near, the way everything seemed to shift when he looked at me in that way. I hated myself for it, for feeling this way, but I couldn't deny that I wanted more. I tried to keep my distance, to bury the feelings that were slowly consuming me, but each passing day only made it harder. My husband was gone again, off on yet another business trip, and as the silence in the house settled around me, I found myself feeling more alone than ever. There was no one here to keep me grounded, no one to remind me of the boundaries I was supposed to respect. The house felt too empty, and his absence made the tension between Artem and me more palpable. He was always there, his presence felt in every corner of the house, in the quiet moments, in the subtle touches that no longer felt accidental. I tried to focus on my responsibilities, to pretend like nothing had changed, but it was getting harder to ignore the growing connection between us. He wasn't just passing through, he was becoming a fixture in my life, and every interaction with him felt more charged than the last. And then, of course, there were the moments when his teasing began. He'd look at me with that knowing smile, one that made my heart skip a beat, and say things that were too intimate for someone who was supposed to be nothing more than my stepson. He'd tell me I looked beautiful when I was just waking up in the morning, still in my robe, hair a mess, or when I was doing something as mundane as making coffee in the kitchen. His words were always laced with something deeper, something that made my skin tingle, something that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just compliments anymore. It was flirtation, a game he was playing, a dangerous game. And I was starting to play along. At first I'd laugh it off, pretending it didn't affect me, but the truth was, it was getting harder and harder to ignore the way he made me feel. I wasn't blind. I could see the way he looked at me, the way he stood a little too close, the way his fingers brushed against mine when we passed each other in the hallway. I could feel the intensity in his gaze when he thought I wasn't looking, and it made my heart race every single time. His presence, the way he made me feel. I wasn't blind. I could see the way he looked at me, the way he stood a little too close, the way his fingers brushed against mine when we passed each other in the hallway. I could feel the intensity in his gaze when he thought I wasn't looking, and it made my heart race every single time. His presence was intoxicating, and the more I tried to resist, the stronger my attraction became. One afternoon I was in the living room flipping through a magazine trying to distract myself from the thoughts that kept creeping into my mind. He sat down next to me too close and I could feel his leg brushing against mine. He leaned in, his voice low and teasing as he made some offhand remark about how my husband was missing out. His words sent a shiver down my spine, and before I could stop myself, I felt a smile tug at my lips. I shouldn't have smiled, I knew that, but I couldn't help it. The line between duty and desire was blurring, and I was no longer sure where one ended and the other began. I was stuck in this whirlwind of emotions, torn between the love I was supposed to have for my husband and the undeniable chemistry I shared with Artem. It wasn't supposed to be this way, but here I was, caught in the middle, unable to escape the pull of something I knew I shouldn't want but couldn't stop craving. The moment Artem and I were alone in the room, the air between us felt thick with something unsaid, something electric, like an invisible line we both knew we were standing on, but neither of us wanted to step back from. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there looking at me, his gaze intense, almost searching, like he was looking for something inside me, or maybe I was looking for something inside him. It wasn't just a moment anymore. It was a decision, a choice we both made, even if we couldn't articulate it yet. The room seemed to close in on us, the silence stretching out, until finally he moved toward me, slowly but deliberately, as though the space between us had never existed. He reached out, and before I could process it, his lips were on mine. It wasn't like the kiss before, the accidental one that shocked me. This one was different, heavier with intention, and when he kissed me, it wasn't just a physical connection. It felt like something deeper, something we were both acknowledging. I didn't pull back, even though every part of me screamed that this was wrong. His hand slid to the small of my back, pulling me closer, and I couldn't stop the shiver that ran through me. I was drowning in it, in the feel of his body so close to mine, in the sound of his breath against my skin. When the kiss finally broke, I stood there breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to say something, anything to stop this from happening, but the words stuck in my throat. And as much as I wanted to deny it, I knew that something had shifted. It wasn't just a kiss. It was the beginning of something I couldn't control. The door slammed open with the familiar sound of my husband's key turning in the lock, and instantly, the reality of the situation hit me like a cold wave. I pulled away from Artem, feeling the sharp contrast between the warmth we had shared and the icy silence that now filled the room. My heart raced, not just from the kiss but from the anxiety that bubbled up inside me. My husband was home and nothing would be the same after this. I tried to steady my breath, to appear composed, but the weight of what had just happened felt unbearable. As my husband walked in, his eyes flicked briefly between Artem and me, a look I couldn't quite decipher, but it was enough to make my stomach tighten. He didn't ask any questions, didn't even acknowledge the palpable tension in the room, but I could see it in his eyes. He was noticing something between us that hadn't been there before. And as the days went on, it became clear. The distance that had once been between us had narrowed, and now, it wasn't just the physical space that felt different. It was the way he looked at me, the way he seemed to be watching, waiting for something he couldn't quite understand. The suspicion in his eyes was barely noticeable, but I saw it. I felt it. He didn't say anything, but the shift was undeniable. I knew he was becoming aware, though not in the way I had feared. It wasn't anger yet. It was curiosity, suspicion, the feeling that something was off, that things weren't quite right between his wife and his son. And as the weight of that realization settled over me, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to unravel. The days that followed my husband's return were filled with an unspoken tension, a new weight that hung between us like a dark cloud that neither of us dared acknowledge. He hadn't left on his business trip like he usually did, and each morning felt like I was walking through a fog, trying to navigate my way through a house that no longer felt like my own. With him here, the space that had once seemed so empty was now suffocating, and I found myself constantly on edge, afraid that one wrong move, one misplaced glance might give everything away. Artem and I were now forced to be more careful, more calculated in how we interacted with each other. Every time we passed in the hallway, every time our eyes met across the room, there was a moment, brief but charged, where the air seemed to thicken. We had become masters of subtlety, learning how to communicate without words, to share those fleeting moments of connection without anyone noticing. But the more we played this dangerous game, the more it felt like we were both teetering on the edge of something irreversible. It wasn't just a game anymore. It was a dance of deception, where the lines between truth and lies became so blurred that I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The thrill of it, the danger, made my heart race, but so did the fear. What were we doing? What would happen if my husband ever caught on? The thought terrified me, but there was a part of me that couldn't stop, couldn't pull away from the magnetic pull I felt when Artem was near. The more I resisted, the more he seemed to draw me in. His presence had become intoxicating, and I couldn't ignore the way my body responded to him, the way every touch, every whisper, seemed to fuel a fire I couldn't extinguish. And then one evening when my husband was in another room, I found myself alone with Artem in the kitchen. The space between us felt like it closing in, the air heavy with anticipation, and I knew even before he moved closer that we were about to cross a line. His hand brushed mine as he reached for the salt, a simple gesture that sent a jolt through me. I turned to face him, my heart pounding, and without thinking I kissed him. It was quick, almost urgent, a desperate need that overtook my better judgment. I knew it was reckless, that it could ruin everything, but in that moment I didn't care. My thoughts were drowned out by the feeling of his lips on mine, the heat that spread through my body, and the realization that there was no turning back now. I pulled away, my breath ragged, and in the silence that followed, I felt the weight of the decision I had just made. As I tried to gather my thoughts, I heard the sound of the front door opening, and I knew with a sickening certainty that it was my husband. He was home. The risk had been taken. And as I stood there trying to steady my breath, I realized that I had just made a choice, one that would change everything. I wasn't sure if it was the right choice, but I couldn't undo it now. The consequences were coming, and I didn't know if I was ready to face them. It wasn't long before the tension in the house became unbearable, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me like an invisible hand. My husband, though still distant, had started to notice the subtle changes in our interactions. He didn't ask directly, but I could tell. His eyes would linger a little longer than usual whenever he caught a glimpse of Artem and me together, a shift in his demeanor that I couldn't ignore. He wasn't the type to confront things head-on, but his silence was more telling than any words could have been. I tried to brush it off, but I knew something was coming. It started with small, seemingly insignificant things. The way Artem would stand a little too close, the way our conversation seemed to have an underlying current that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Then came the moment when my husband, without saying a word, dropped a comment about how he'd noticed the chemistry between me and his son. The way he said it so casually made my stomach churn. It wasn't an accusation, but it didn't need to be. He had seen something, felt something, and I couldn't deny it anymore. I wasn't sure how to respond. The truth was, I didn't know how to explain this growing attraction to my husband without completely shattering the fragile facade I had worked so hard to maintain. I had tried to convince myself that it was just a fleeting moment, a mistake, but deep down I knew it was more than that. I was falling into something I didn't understand, and no matter how much I tried to fight it, the pull toward Artem only grew stronger. He knew how to make me feel alive again, how to make me feel like I was desired, needed, something I hadn't felt in years. The more I tried to distance myself, the more he seemed to reel me back in, always finding ways to get closer, to play on my emotions. He would tease me, remind me of the moments we shared in silence, of the things left unsaid between us. Every glance, every touch, every quiet word felt like a temptation I couldn't resist. He made me feel special, like I was the only one in the world who mattered, and that feeling consumed me more than I cared to admit. And now, standing at the edge of it all, I realized I was at a crossroads. I could keep pretending, keep hiding the truth, and let the guilt eat away at me, slowly destroying everything I had built. My marriage, my sense of self. Or I could face the truth, confront what was happening between me and Artem, and risk losing everything. My heart was torn between the two choices. The temptation to give in to this forbidden desire was overwhelming, but the reality of what it would cost me was starting to sink in. If I admitted what was really happening, I would never be able to undo it. But if I continued to hide, to lie to myself and to my husband, I would be living a lie, and that was no better. It was a decision I couldn't avoid any longer. The question was, which path would I choose, and could I live with the consequences? The night felt different from the start, the kind of night where every sound echoed a little louder, where every glance carried something unsaid. I should have known it would spiral out of control, but the truth was, I had already let it. The boundary I swore I wouldn't cross had been blurring for weeks, and now, standing in the dim glow of the kitchen, the air between us charged with something neither of us had the strength to deny, I realized there was no going back. It started with a conversation, one that felt too personal, too intimate for what we were supposed to be. His voice was low, steady, carrying that weight of quiet confidence he always had when he was trying to get inside my head. He wasn't pressing, just there, watching me, reading my hesitation, knowing exactly how to keep me lingering just a little longer than I should. I told myself I'd step away, that I wouldn't let this moment become more than what it was. But then he moved closer, his hand brushing the countertop beside mine, his breath just close enough that I could feel its warmth. I should have pulled away. I should have laughed it off, made a comment, done anything but what I did. Instead, I turned toward him, and in that brief second where our eyes met, I knew he felt it too. It wasn't just attraction. It wasn't just a game. It was something deeper, something neither of us had spoken out loud. It was the kind of connection that made you forget consequences, made you forget the reality of what you were risking. And before I could think, before I could stop myself, I reached for him. The touch was fleeting, hesitant, like a question I was too afraid to ask. But the moment his fingers brushed mine, something inside me collapsed. He was close now, too close, and the silence between us wasn't just silence. It was anticipation, the kind that left you breathless. His lips parted, his expression unreadable, and in that moment, I knew we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't undo. And then the door slammed. The sharp, jarring sound shattered everything in an instant. My heart lurched as I spun around, and there he was. My husband. And then the door slammed. The sharp, jarring sound shattered everything in an instant. My heart lurched as I spun around, and there he was. My husband. Standing in the doorway, his face frozen in something between shock and understanding, his eyes flicking between us, between the way I stood too close, the way Artem's hand was still resting near mine. I stepped back too fast, as if that could erase what had just happened, but it was too late. The realization was already dawning in his expression, a slow, creeping awareness that made my stomach turn. What's going on? His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight, a weight that made my breath catch. I opened my mouth to speak, to give him some kind of answer, but nothing came. Artem, standing beside me, didn't say a word either. The silence was worse than any confession. It stretched between us like a wound that had just been ripped open, raw and undeniable. My husband's gaze locked onto mine, and for the first time in years, I saw something I never thought I'd see in his eyes. Betrayal. It was a quiet kind of fury, the kind that didn't need shouting to be heard. Is this a joke? His voice was sharper now, but still controlled, as if he was giving me one last chance to prove him wrong. But there was nothing I could say, nothing I could do to take back what he had already seen. Artem finally spoke, his tone calm but laced with something unreadable. It's not what you think. But even I could hear the lie in those words. My husband let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. Not what I think. Then tell me what this is. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you two have been playing some kind of game behind my back. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I tried to find a way to explain, to make him believe that he was wrong, that it hadn't gone that far. But the way his expression hardened, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides, told me that it didn't matter. He had already decided. And in that moment I knew. I had lost him. Whatever we had, whatever foundation we had built, it was gone. And the worst part was, I wasn't even sure if I regretted it. He didn't yell. He didn't ask for an explanation. He just looked at me with the kind of expression that left no room for negotiation. A look that said, "This is over." A look that told me he had already made his decision. I wanted him to say something, anything, to give me a chance to fix what had just been shattered. But the silence between us was louder than any screaming match could have been. I could see it in his clenched jaw, in the way his hands balled into tight fists at his sides, in the way his breath came out slow and deliberate, like he was forcing himself not to react. His eyes flicked toward Artem, then back to me, and for the briefest second I thought he might change his mind. But then he let out a breath, a sharp final exhale that felt like the closing of a door, and when he spoke his voice was eerily calm. "I can't do this." He turned and walked away. I stood there frozen, my body unwilling to move, my mind unable to comprehend what had just happened. The sound of him moving through the house was deafening. The opening of drawers, the rustling of clothes, the sharp zip of a suitcase being dragged across the floor. I wanted to stop him, to make him listen, to somehow convince him that this wasn't what he thought it was, even though we both knew it was exactly that. But I stayed rooted in place, my hands gripping the edge of the counter, my heart hammering so hard in my chest I thought I might pass out. By the time I gathered the courage to follow him, he was already at the door, one hand gripping the handle, the other adjusting the strap of his bag. He didn't look at me when he spoke. I hope it was worth it. Then the door opened, and before I could even take a step forward, it slammed shut behind him. And just like that he was gone. The silence left in his wake was suffocating, thick and inescapable. I felt the weight of it settle on my shoulders, pressing me down, forcing me to acknowledge what I had done. My husband had walked away from our marriage, from everything we had built together, because of me. Because of my choices. Because of my inability to stop something that should have never started. And the worst part? I wasn't even sure if I deserved to feel this broken over it. Behind me I felt Artem shift, his presence suddenly unbearable. I turned slowly, my vision blurry, my breath uneven, and when I saw him standing there, arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable, something inside me cracked. He looked just as lost as I felt. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his voice quiet, uncertain. I let out a bitter laugh. "Neither did I." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply as he looked away, his jaw tightening like he was trying to find the right thing to say but couldn't. The tension between us felt different now. No longer laced with forbidden excitement, no longer filled with that intoxicating electric charge. It was heavy. It was suffocating. It was real. "Maybe I should leave," he muttered, his gaze flicking toward the door like he was considering following in my husband's footsteps. For a moment I wanted to tell him to stay. I wanted to cling to him, to hold on to the one thing that had set all of this into motion, because without him, I wasn't sure what I had left. But I knew better. I knew that even if he stayed, it wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't make what we had done any less wrong. It wouldn't undo the damage we had caused. "Do whatever you want," I said, my voice hollow. He hesitated just for a second, and in that pause I saw it. The guilt, the regret, the realization that we had destroyed something we could never repair. And then he nodded, turning away from me without another word. When the door closed behind him, I was finally alone. I sank onto the couch, my hands trembling as I pressed my palms against my face, trying to block out the reality of what had just happened. But there was no escaping it. I had ruined my marriage. I had lost the one person who had been by my side for years. And for what? A fleeting moment? A selfish decision? A desire I should have never entertained? The weight of it all hit me at once, crashing over me like a tidal wave, leaving me gasping for breath. I thought about my husband, about the way he looked at me before he left. I thought about the life we had built together, about the years we had spent creating something that I had so easily thrown away.